Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, welcome to the 10th Sea Change webinar, the 7th one of the 2012 series, and titled Integrating Climate Change Policies into Sustainable Development Strategy using the Sustainomics Framework. I see that right now we have 22 attendees, but with over 100 registrants, I'm expecting that some more people will log in the next minutes. My name is Dennis Boers, and I'm the Sea Change team leader. I would like to warmly welcome as well our presenter of today, Professor Mohan Munasinghe, Chairman of the Munasinghe Institute for Development, MIND in short. And I will introduce him a bit more in depth in a moment. But let me get back to the title, Integrating Climate Change Policies into Sustainable Development Strategy using the Sustainomics Framework. This webinar will introduce a comprehensive framework to practically address two major global challenges. The first one being sustainable development and the second one being climate change. The most effective approach is to integrate climate change policies into national sustainable development strategy. And for that, in this webinar, we will use the Sustainomics framework. Development problems like poverty are already formidable, and climate change is the ultimate risk multiplier in that sense, worsening other crises. Its worst impact fall on the poor who are least responsible for the problem, and reducing their vulnerability to such impacts is critical. A brief background shows how the world currently faces multiple economic, social and environmental threats. The economic collapse is the most urgent. The social crisis arises from global poverty, inequity and inappropriate governance. Finally, mankind has caused severe environmental damage, including climate change, and present trends could destabilize global society. The way forward requires better use of economic stimulus packages to support green investments, social safety nets, and better price policies. A longer-term vision goes beyond our current focus on surface-level indicators. Instead, deeper issues need to be addressed systematically, focusing on both the immediate drivers and underlying pressures. In the webinar, key principles of the Sustainomics framework are outlined. First is the practical step-by-step approach of making development more sustainable. And second, we need a balanced and integrated analysis for three main perspectives: social, economic and environmental. And third, the analysis must transcend conventional boundaries imposed by discipline, space, time, stakeholder viewpoints, and operationality. Finally, Sustainomics provides many practical tools. More information can be found on www.mindlanka.org and on www.mohanmunasinghe.com. And the address of Sea Change is seachangecop.org. Webinars are one way in which we share knowledge to improve M&E practices related to climate change. But next to webinars, we also send out a weekly newsletter, we maintain a resource library, and we support our members in speaking engagements at conferences. If you'd be interested, just have a look at our website. Let me now introduce to you Professor Mohan Munasinghe. Professor Munasinghe shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize as Vice Chairman of the UN IPCC AR4. And AR4 stands for the 4th IPCC Assessment Report. For work on global warming and sustainable development. Currently, he is Chairman of the Munasinghe Institute for Development, based in Colombo. He is also Professor of Sustainable Development at the Sustainable Consumption Institute, University of Manchester in the UK. And he is Distinguished Guest Professor at the Peking University in China. He is recognized as a leading expert on sustainable development, climate change, energy and environment. He is especially known for having developed at Rio 1992 the Sustainomics framework that applies transdisciplinary thinking to make development more sustainable, and for proposing the novel idea of the Millennium Consumption Goals. He has had direct field experience in climate change, disaster management, economics, environment, energy, transport, urban infrastructure and water resource projects in many countries. He is also fellow of several international academies of science and serves on the editorial boards of a dozen professional journals. A little bit of logistics information for this webinar session. The webinar presentation will take 40 to 45 minutes, after which there will be time for questions and answers. Any questions that have not been answered during the 30-minute Q&A session, or 20 to 30, will be answered offline and published on our website afterwards. To ask a question, you can raise your hand and then ask it later on. Or even simpler, you can type a question in the question field in the software, after which we will present the question to our presenter. As said, any questions that are not answered during the 30-minute Q&A session will be answered later on offline and will be put online together with the recording of the webinar. With this introduction, I now should stop talking and hand over to the screen and microphone to the person for whom you have all signed up today. Let me give the word to Professor Munasinghe.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me? Good. It's a privilege to be presenting this workshop, and thank also Len's Boots and I thank C-Change for making it possible. I hope you're seeing my screen now. This is my very first screen.
Yes, we do.
You should be seeing it clearly and hearing me well also. I will take about 45 minutes to make my presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions. But I'll have to go through my slides fairly fast. You will have time to come back to it later if I miss some point that you particularly wanted to listen to. So how do we integrate climate policies into sustainable development? Let's talk about that. First, let me start by saying this talk is based on a very comprehensive full graduate seminar that is offered also by MIND called Sustainomics, Sustainable Development, Climate Change. It has been given worldwide at a number of universities. It is also on the internet paced to suit the convenience of students, and if you're interested in that course, you can contact me later. That's all the advertising I'll do. Now let's get on with the main material. What are the challenges? Okay, we have multiple threats that undermine sustainable development, and we need integrated solutions. Let's start with the global risk of breakdown because of the ongoing, let's say, financial economic crisis. There has been persistent poverty and so on for many decades. There are resource shortages of water, food, energy, all kinds of environmental harm. And of course there's climate change, which is the ultimate threat amplifier. Now these are synergistic. Unfortunately, the stakeholder interests are very divergent. In particular, there's a distinct lack of political will. Responses are very uncoordinated, and we need to do something about that. To start off with, from the point of view of the ecological footprint of human consumption, humanity is consuming the equivalent of 1.5 times what the Earth can currently produce. And by 2035 we'll be consuming almost 2 planets worth. And of course they have other threats like nuclear arms, which can wipe us off the planet completely. Now, most of the poor people that we talked about, these poverty, live in the developing world, and they are also the most undernourished. the green areas are the countries that are doing well. Almost all the other countries are malnourished in some form or the other. And of course you have the very unfair world income consumption distribution, where more than 80% of the consumption is done by the top 20% of wealth owners in the country. They are consuming more than 60 times the equivalent of the poorer people at the bottom of that champagne glass. And now I'm having a problem. Just give me a second, my screen has frozen. Okay, there we go. Let's now see why climate change is a problem, because it affects in particular poor countries and poorer groups who are the most vulnerable. This is of course manifestly very unfair, because the poor had the least to do with causing the problem. They are the ones who will suffer most. At the same time, the IPCC fourth assessment report made very clear that making development more sustainable is a way of integrating climate change into sustainable development strategy. That is the best way to go, rather than dealing with climate change piecemeal. Now, why not? Let's take a few examples. Why uncoordinated responses complicate matters. If you look at the oil crisis and what happened with the corn for ethanol program, which was promoted as a substitute for oil. In 2007, there was a drought which was caused by nature, which led to a grain shortage. Now that combined with the diversion of corn for ethanol to cause a worldwide food scarcity. There were food riots, many millions of people died. So that's why we need coordinated solutions. Now let's look very quickly at what we are doing at the moment. Are we doing well handling the problems of today? If you look at the way the world is structured, you have financial markets and economic growth at the top. These are, for example, how the stock markets are doing, what is the GNP growth rate, those kinds of numbers which we focus on. Immediately below that is what are called the productive economic assets. Those are, for example, the capital, the labor, and other things that produce the wealth, the money. And at the very bottom, the fundamental one are the biogeophysical resources on which everything else depends. Now, ideally, these three should be closely aligned and coordinated. Then things work well. But unfortunately, this is not the case. For example, the asset bubble of 2008, which many countries are still suffering through, separated the financial markets or the value of assets from their true economic value. And when the bubble burst, many people were thrown into misery, and we had a recession, particularly in the Western countries. If you look, that is the financial bubble. If you look at the social bubble, that is the poverty bubble. These high economic growth rates that are quoted often hide an unpleasant truth, and that is there are 2 billion poor people in the world today. And when that bubble bursts, things are also going to look pretty bad. And of course, at the very bottom, we have the environmental externalities, which separate us from the economic activities. And that is what is causing most of the environmental problems, including climate change. Now, if you look at how we deal with these problems, if you look at the asset bubble, the governments and leaders found very quickly more than $5 trillion to solve that problem, mainly to bail out rich banks and companies. For the problem of poverty, we are spending about 100 billion a year, and that is 1/50th the other amount. And for climate change, for example, a few $billion, pocket change. So world military expenditures are now close to 2 trillion. You can imagine that with these kinds of priorities and deployment of resources, whether we will actually solve the problems that we now face. Let's talk very briefly about climate change. Since most of you are already familiar with this through the work of sea change, I will be very brief on this. You know that carbon acts as a blanket, warming up the Earth more than it should. This is caused, of course, by the concentrations of greenhouse gases following the Industrial Revolution, where, for example, carbon dioxide use spiked in the last 200 years. This means basically in a nutshell that by 2100, that if we continue with business as usual, we're going to wind up with maybe something in excess of 550 parts per million by volume of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is at least twice the safe level. The safe level was 280, which was before the Industrial Revolution. The temperature rise corresponding to that is at least 3 degrees, probably very much more, maybe 4. The sea level rise is at least half a meter and possibly more. Now, why is this important? Why? Because if you look at the impacts on food, water, ecosystems, extreme weather events, and so on, you see that around 2 degrees Celsius, these arrows, which indicate the worsening of the problem, all start turning red. So what we face then is this worsening of all the other problems because of climate change impacts. And of course there is a large-scale risk that, for example, if something like the Arctic ice sheets, Antarctic ice sheets melt, then we are going to have sea level rise of the order of 6 to 8 meters, okay, not centimeters. So that's very severe. Now, how we deal with this is the following. If you look at this rather complicated diagram, on the right-hand side is the Sustainable Development domain. You see that it is giving rise to the fat arrow at the bottom, which are greenhouse gas emissions that is caused by human activities. Now, those greenhouse gas emissions drive the climate domain, and it interferes with the climate system through a process called radiative forcing. And then, of course, the empire strikes back. The climate domain, if you look at the top arrow going from left to right, climate change stressors, including temperature, sea level, and so on, affect human and natural systems, and that in turn will affect our development path. So you have a complete cycle, which is quite destructive. Now, what do? We introduce two filters. One is called adaptation, which means that if the stresses become bad, we can adapt. So if the sea level goes up, we can build a wall to keep the sea out. The other filter is called mitigation, which says that in order to make climate change better, we should reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And this is the two tools that human beings have to deal with the problem. Now, adaptation. We know what we need to do to protect the most vulnerable, the people, the poor, the children, elderly, the regions, the small islands, the Arctic, and so on, various sectors, including water resources, human health, coral reefs, and so on. We know what we can do to protect them, but unfortunately nothing is being done because governments are very slow. Not nothing, but too little. At the same time, we also know what we need to do to prevent the temperature going above the 2-degree danger limit. Okay, particularly in terms of energy and land use, there are many actions that can be taken. There are many sectors like energy, transport, and buildings which can contribute in almost all regions of the world. So we know also the key policy elements. Now, unfortunately, if you look at the recent global meetings, very little has been done, and that is part of the problem. I'll skip these. If we don't act on this, we have unrestrained market forces, particularly lacking in ethical and moral values, which is combining with these problems that I mentioned, like poverty, inequity, and of course climate change, which can lead to a chaotic situation, a breakdown, and a fortress world mentality where the rich will live in enclaves, basically keeping out the poor who are living in misery. And that's not a world you or I would like to live in. right? Now, what is the way forward? Okay, now we are getting closer to some of the solutions. This is basically my take on the asset crisis, which basically says that 100 million people were thrown out of work, especially the poor, by the last asset crisis. But I believe the financial sector has not learned very much. We are just returning to business as usual, and that is what we have to try and change. So we lost an opportunity to use the $5 trillion in bailout money to actually invest in green energy, in forestry, agriculture, and sustainable livelihoods and so on. We need to use this momentum for change to make development more sustainable. And how do we do that? Well, if we don't, what we are continue to do is to depend on myopic market forces, the world of the Washington Consensus and globalization. We have piecemeal solutions, which are governments mainly reacting to problems, and this business as usual is very risky for the future. What we need to do is to look at the immediate drivers. What are the drivers of all the surface problems like poverty and environment? There are four. One is consumption, of course. The second one is the production and the technology we use. Population is an important driver, and of course governance, or should I say misgovernance. Now, what we need to do is to make development more sustainable with the systematic reform of market forces. We have to use a proactive approach where business and civil society have to push governments to do the right thing. And that is how we can actually start integrating climate change into sustainable development strategy and to solving all the problems. If we do this properly today in the transition, then we give our children and grandchildren a chance in the future, in the long term, to really deal with underlying pressures, basic needs, social power structure, values, and so on. That would be in 20, 30 years' time, when we'll be aiming for a really sustainable world with social justice, ethics, innovative leadership, new technologies, and so on. But in order to get to that, we have to do the transition, the middle step. Now, this is where Sustainomics comes in, and let me go through very quickly with that. First, this is a complex world, so we need again to stress an integrated framework. The first principle basically says make development more sustainable. What is this all about? This is really a call for empowerment, for action. Okay. There are many definitions of sustainable development since the Brundtland report in '87. But we don't need to be defining sustainable development. What we need to do is to make it more sustainable step by step. This is like climbing a mountain. If you see that the peak sustainable development is really covered with clouds and it's rather mysterious, we don't need to understand it perfectly. All we need to do is walk up one step at a time, and eventually we will reach the peak, right? So what could we do as individuals? We could have plant trees, we could eat less meat, we could switch to green power. So many things that can be done at the personal level where we are obviously doing unsustainable things. At the level of companies and groups, there's the whole CSR framework, sustainability accounting and reporting, the concept of shared value. We'll talk about all of these. And at the national level, again, we have good news that all the mainstream sectors of the economy like agriculture, energy, and industry can be greened. We can, in fact, integrate climate change and environmental policies into these sectors. We have the models and methods. It's just that most of the ministries of finance and industry are development are too lazy to do this kind of thing, and it should be done, right? The second principle of Sustainomics, which is very important, is called harmonizing the sustainable development triangle. It's for balance and integration. When I presented this triangle for the first time in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit 20 years ago, there was some controversy. Some people didn't quite like it. But in the 20 years that have ensued, people now agree that all three elements are important. We need to balance among them. Economic, of course. If you're poor, you need more money. You need to become more prosperous. The social side is important for inclusion, for distribution of income, empowerment, and good governance. And the environment, extremely important if you want to stop pollution and depletion of natural resources. Now, almost any subject you want to think of, including climate change, can be analyzed in terms of the three dimensions. And what is important is the balance, that it is not one or the other, but all three kept in equilibrium. And different groups and different countries can balance them in different ways. That's fine. That is people's choice. The so-called green economy is actually mainly focusing on the economic and environmental. But we should be very careful when we interpret it, not to do so too narrowly and to leave out people, not to leave out the social dimension. Just a warning, right? We have three kinds of assets that deal with sustainable development, and of course we have the manufactured capital, the roads, the highways, the buildings, and so on. So the natural capital, which are the lakes, the forests, and so on, and of course the social capital, you and I, a human society, which is actually the most important one, and the one which we neglect the most. In fact, it is the glue that binds us together, and that is the type of capital that we ignore at our peril. In a lot of countries in the world, conflicts are caused by erosion of this social capital. The third aspect is called transcending boundaries, and this is a call for innovation. This is actually something that you and I can contribute to our own thinking. We need to transcend barriers by replacing, for example, unsustainable values with more sustainable ones. We need to have transdisciplinary analysis. It is not just a question of medicine or engineering or law, but all of the above. We need to think in terms of long time spans, centuries. We think in terms of global scales. We need multi-stakeholder approaches where civil society and business work with governments and so on. And basically, here you will see that the status quo will always try to stop the innovation. But we have to work against this. We have to always think outside the box, like the cat. And particularly, I would say, building essential ethical values among the youth is a major, major step. Greed, selfishness, and violence are manifestly unsustainable. We need selflessness, enlightened self-interest, respect for humans and nature in order to become more sustainable. But in fact, what is happening is that the world is being driven by an unsustainable triangle. First, we have unethical social values like greed and selfishness, and that is causing what I call economic maldevelopment, which is growth is based on unsustainable debt and waste. Our grandparents, for example, believed in the value of thrift, of saving, so that we could consume more today. But we have, instead of saving, we are in fact, based in the Western countries, borrowing from their grandchildren, so to speak. So, living well, borrowing from the future is not a very wise policy, because what that causes are enormous debts which will have to be paid by those very same grandchildren. And finally, the shortage of resources is going to cause more conflict and more greed. And this is what is happening at the present time. We need to transcend disciplines, as I said. We need to transcend stakeholder barriers where civil society and business need to work with government, and sea change can be a powerful force for this. And then, of course, I come now to the very last core element of Sustainomics, and that is that we do have, in fact, many practical analytical tools, and there are many available case studies. So this is not an empty box. We can actually implement this. I'll try and run through very few case studies because we don't really have time, right? And starting with the importance of integration of different approaches. What do we mean here? First is that from the economic point of view, we tend to optimize things. So people always talk about getting maximum GNP, and then people conveniently forget that maximizing GNP might cause damage to the environment or leave out the poor or something like that. But the ecological and social perspectives are a little different. They talk more about viability and resilience. There are economic, ecological and social systems, and the idea is not to optimize or tweak the maximum out of those systems. The idea is to keep them healthy and viable for a long period of time. So we have to keep this balance between the economic approach, which is trying to get the maximum, with important ecological and social constraints. And of course, there are multiplicity of sustainable development indicators that tell us the health of all of these systems, and we choose the indicators that are relevant for the task. So let's now move on and look at some of the applications that are possible. We'll start with a global application, which is how do we reconcile climate risk with sustainable development? This is an important question for particularly decision makers in the developing countries who fear that if they join in the fight against climate, they'll have to give up growth and poverty alleviation. This is not the case at all. Part of the problem is the following, that if you look here, this brown area is the share of carbon dioxide emissions, which on a per capita basis should have been the right of the developing countries, the so-called non-Annex I countries. What is shown here from here down to the bottom are actually what has been or will be emitted by the rich countries, the Annex I countries. On the basis of per capita emissions, they should have only emitted the blue portion. So this 210 gigatons of emissions are actually excess, overuse of the global atmosphere, of the carbon space by the rich countries. And that is what all the discussions at the Climate Convention are all about. What is the equity aspect? When somebody overuses something, even if they didn't know about it at the time, they do know about it now. What can we do about that? This is the southern viewpoint, where they feel that the fat person is eating a major part of the cake, but also asking the thin person to cut back on their consumption. Okay. Now, coming back to home truths, for the developing countries, the main issue is adaptation and reducing the threat or the vulnerability of the poor in those countries who are extremely poor. So that is their first priority. For the rich countries who are here at the left consuming large amounts per capita, North America and Europe, at least 10 times more than Asia and South and Africa in terms of carbon emissions per capita, they should show leadership in mitigation. But these countries have not. As I said, they have shirked their responsibility for the last 15 or 20 years. Of course, the best is that these adaptation and mitigation policies should be integrated with climate change, with development strategy, and this is what we are talking about. If we grow forests, if we save energy, then we can reduce the effect on the climate, but also have a boost to the economic system. Now, we can show this in a way with this plot where I have greenhouse gas emissions on the vertical axis, per capita income on the horizontal axis. So climate versus development. If you're poor, you're down here. If you're rich, you're up here above the safe limit for emissions. And most countries are in the middle here at B. Now, what is the first thing that one needs to do? This is the model that I presented to the Danish Prime Minister's office before the Copenhagen meetings in 2007, 2008. Unfortunately, nobody was listening to me. So the first solution is that the rich countries, and this is what the Kyoto Protocol says, the rich countries have to decarbonize, they have to transform their economies and reduce their emissions below the safe limit. But notice at the same time they keep going to the right. They don't have to become poor. They can do the right thing but still maintain good quality of life. And of course you have to have an adaptation safety net for countries like the Maldives, which will go under water very soon. Now, what about the middle income countries? This is the other part of the bargain. They have to find a tunnel, because if the billions of people who are poor now try to follow the same profligate curve of the rich, there is not enough carbon space, there is not enough water, there is not enough energy. None of those resources will be sufficient. Now, we see many countries trying this, and in fact China is one of the best examples of finding this tunnel, which is basically saying you can become prosperous, but you also are much more resource efficient. And also you keep your greenhouse gas emissions low. In fact, the countries that follow this path will be much more competitive. Those countries that have to reduce their emissions and reduce their material use have a much harder struggle adapting to this resource scarce world. Of course, we need technology, cooperation, and support to do all of these things. I'm going to skip this part, and if in the question period you ask me about it, we can talk about clean development mechanism and emissions trading as one of the methods of dealing with mitigation. But we will skip through this for the moment in order to talk about country level actions. This is that diagram that I showed you before. How do we integrate climate and environment into the mainstream sectors of the economy, basically to show decision makers that you don't have to give up prosperity in order to address environmental issues, to convince them. We have a number of models. We have sectoral models, we have environment and macroeconomic analysis and poverty models and other things that can be done. One of the tools I use in my work is so-called green national income accounts. For those of you familiar with the economic side, you know the input-output table is what drives the economic analysis. To that we can add environmental economic links, satellite environmental accounts, which have now been officially approved by the UN, and I worked with the UN system to develop this. But not many countries keep environmental accounts. They don't keep track of pollution, deforestation and things, but it's time they did. We have something called a social accounting matrix, which tells us how are the poor doing. How is all the wealth generated in the economic system distributed? Is it only going to the rich? And then finally, I have proposed that we should see how the environmental pollution and so on are distributed among the various income classes. And here you will see that it is the poor who suffer mainly on the environmental impacts, not only climate, but also water pollution, air pollution, and so on. Now, we'll go through a very quick example of this integration using water and agriculture to show how it works. First, we have a tool called Action Impact Matrix, which is part of the kit bag for Sustainomics. I don't have time to go into it, but basically to tell you, it is a methodology where you get a group of experts to link national development goals and with key climate change adaptation and mitigation aspects. This has been used for a number of years since the 1990s. It involves at least 50 experts drawn from government, academia, and civil society. They work together cooperatively to come up with a solution over 2 days. This is the output they produce. They look at, for example, key vulnerabilities. This is for Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, agriculture, hydropower, deforestation, biodiversity, poor communities. These are a number of vulnerable areas. Then, of course, you have the growth and development priorities of the country: economic growth, poverty alleviation, food security, employment, and so on. Now, if you look at the interaction of these policies with these vulnerabilities, you put in some numbers, and this is part of the 2-day exercise. If it is a 3, it means the impact is high. If it is plus, it's beneficial. Minus is harmful. So that's why this -3 is marked in bright red. What it means is that climate change is going to hammer agricultural output. It is going to affect water resources adversely, and that is going to threaten the food security of Sri Lanka. There are other -2 impacts as well. But for the moment, let's look at this nexus: agriculture, water resources, and food security, right? For Sri Lanka, what is the detailed model that we look at? First, you know, we have general circulation models of the global atmosphere, which allow us to project climate. Now, looking at Sri Lanka, we downscale some of the results to focus on Sri Lanka, and we can predict what the climate of Sri Lanka might be in 2050. For example, more rain or higher temperature and so on. Then we link this with a multi-sector model. There's a computable general equilibrium model at the top, which is macroeconomic. We have an agricultural model, and then we have models of different sectors, like rice production, tea and rubber and coconut, which we produce, and so on. Now, how do we put it all together? Well, the models can tell us what is going on now, and then we make predictions for 2050 based on the new climate that we expect. And what do we find? For the 2 most significant results we found, and this is actually more than 1 year of work I'm summarizing in a few slides, that in the dry zone of the country, the rice production dropped very sharply. And these are actually poor farmers. In the wet zone of the country, which is the mountain areas, plantation crops, for example tea, the output actually went up. So the net effect is balanced. One goes up and one goes down. But you can see that even in a poor country, the poor people are getting poorer because their crops are dropping. The richer plantation owners are doing better. So even in this small country of Sri Lanka, these are GIS maps, the poor are getting poorer, or the poor will, and the rich will get richer. So the overall impact is moderate, but there is a significant risk to food security, high impact on small farmers, very significant equity impact, and of course demographic implications, because people will move from the dry zone to the wet zone. Okay, these were important results which helped the government start planning for that. So that's the kind of analysis how we integrate climate into sustainable development strategy. And similar things can be done with mitigation as well, right? Now, at the subnational and at the local level, we can also do similar kinds of analysis. We have a number of tools, and I don't again have time to go through with it. I think many of you are familiar with cost-benefit analysis, which is the economic assessment tool. There are environmental assessments, social assessments, multicriteria analysis, poverty, and so on. All of these are filters which we apply to projects, right? Let me particularly tell you that economic valuation of environmental impacts is an important part of cost-benefit analysis. It is not always possible. We can't value everything under the sun. If we cannot value some social and environmental impacts, we can use something called multi-criteria analysis for decision making. Okay? So here are some of the methods of valuing environmental impacts. For example, the use value let us say in a forest you have food, biomass and recreation, indirect values which would be flood control, ecological functions, and then even other non-use values which depend on how much people value, for example, some of the properties of forests, the cultural, the economic, and the cultural and psychological values. Let me skip this part and just talk about the case study. This is the case study of evaluating 22 hydroelectric sites in Sri Lanka. And instead of just looking at the cost alone, which is the economic dimension, we also looked at social and ecological aspects. So what did we do? We looked at three variables. First, of course, the supply costs is one, okay, per unit of greenhouse gas emissions avoided per year. In other words, when you develop a hydro site, you can displace thermal plant, so you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we calculate the cost of supplying that electricity per unit of carbon dioxide emitted. On the social side, we looked at the number of people who are displaced. For example, if we build a dam or something like that. The environmental side, we looked at biodiversity loss, which is, for example, because you have to inundate a forest or something like that. Now, if you plot the three, that is the economic, the cost, the social would be the resettlement, and the ecological, which is the biodiversity loss, the three bars. Here, this way, you don't see much of a pattern. In fact, if you went and showed a minister that, you would be very quickly shown the door, because you can't make any decision on this basis. But if you plot this like this, okay, then you might make some headway. On the vertical axis here is the cost, okay, US cents per greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, ton of carbon dioxide. Here is the number of people resettled per ton of carbon dioxide, and this way into the paper would be how much of biodiversity was lost per ton of carbon dioxide that was saved. Now, in this case, you notice that as you go away from the axis, all three dimensions become worse. This is more costly. Here more people have to be resettled, and here more biodiversity is lost. So all these sites that are plotted near the origin are better. All these sites which are far from the origin are much worse. So without valuing biodiversity or resettlement, we can still make a decision that these sites are better than those. And that is the power of multi-criteria analysis. A very simple example. Now I'm coming to the last few minutes where we talk about action, and I'll talk about sustainable consumers and producers. So this is an application of Sustainomics which talks about how we build a multi-stakeholder coalition. And let's talk about sustainable consumption and production, because basically we are looking to build a 21st century global eco-civilization, which is a Chinese concept. It is based not necessarily on material consumption, but on something called happiness and well-being. I'm working, for example, with the UN and the government of Bhutan to develop an index of happiness and well-being called gross national happiness, which hopefully in 10 years will replace GNP. GNP will be one part of GNH, okay? But happiness is not just consumption. That is a key point. There is a vision that the social vision is that we should meet the basic needs of all human beings and ensure social peace, harmony, and social justice. Environment, that we should reduce the global ecological footprint to one planet Earth, not to exceed our carrying capacity. And on the economic side, to build a sustainable and prosperous resource-efficient economy, but respect environment and social constraints. So we reduce the human footprint from 1.5 to 1. We reduce the unfair distribution of income, and of course we try to meet some of the Millennium Development Goals. We are not doing this at the moment. You see, we are exceeding the planetary footprint. We are very unfair in our distribution. So basically what is happening? we need to reduce the consumption of the rich without reducing their lifestyle or their quality of life. We have to make sure that those who are growing do so sustainably. If you look at this poor family has to be brought out of starvation along a sustainable path, but this family can in fact reduce their packaging and their all the other things, but still consume very much and maintain their lifestyles. Both have to be done. And for that I propose something called Millennium Consumption Goals. My point is that the consumption of the rich is crowding out the development prospects of the poor. And therefore it is very important for the rich to consume more sustainably, and so that this economic goal doesn't crush the social and the environmental goals. And what do the Millennium Consumption Goals tell us? They tell us that we first need to ensure basic needs of every human being, especially the poor, but at the same time the consumption of the rich, the top people at the top of the champagne glass, we have to worry about their greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, water use, and so on. And we have to look out to their food, diet, health, and lifestyles. Because what we are telling people is, instead of consuming so much and being obese and unhealthy, you can actually consume more sustainably and you can be happier and healthier. That is what gross national happiness is about. Why will this work? It will work if we use a softer approach. This is not Big Brother, this is not government or the police coming and telling you what you can and cannot do or eat. We are appealing to the rich and saying you are better educated, you are better motivated, and you are more influential. You have the most to lose if the global system corrupts it. So from the bottom up, let us work. And I'm very happy to tell you that there are many people who are working on this, particularly also producers who are on the production side. But it is also transnational, because we are not talking about the rich only in Western countries, but also groups of rich in the developing world who are conspicuous in their consumption. So Millennium Consumption Goals is part of the green economy which will build this magnificent edifice of sustainable development. And we have a Millennium Consumption Goals initiative which is part of this. I must tell you that most of the effort or the momentum is from the bottom up. We have cities, we have businesses and other institutions and even individuals who are telling us we don't want to wait for our presidents or prime ministers to tell us what to do. We will decide, we will make a pledge. We will halve our CO2 emissions by 2030 or our water footprint and so on. So this is a very positive sign. It's bottom up. We are bringing about sustainable consumption by working with the social capital embedded within individuals and communities. And because leaders at the middle level, like mayors of communities, CEOs of companies, they are more in touch with their own people than national leaders, than presidents and prime ministers. So the middle level is better able to give pledges. And we of course use pricing, advertising, labeling and so on to make development more sustainable and consumption. So what I tell people is, take charge of your life. You must define your meaningful consumption. Do not let meaningless consumption define you, which basically says that your iPod or your wristwatch should not define you. You decide what you consume, right? And to take an example, 1/3 of world food production is lost or wasted, 50% in US homes, 30% in European homes. And at the same time, we have about 1 billion poor people, mainly in Africa and Asia. So that's a kind of contrast which is very striking. So let's talk about pricing as one of the tools, and I'll take maybe 2 or 3 more minutes to wind up. Rising oil prices tell us, according to the rule of economic efficiency, that we must raise prices. Okay. Environmental protection tells us that because energy use is affecting the environment, you have air pollution and so on, that we should introduce taxes which raises the price even more. But the social rule, which is the third element of sustainable development triangle, tells us something entirely different. It says if you just jack up prices, only the rich will be able to afford energy and the poor will be completely left out. And this is unsustainable, inequitable. So we need targeted subsidies to service the energy needs of the poor. So that is the balance of the sustainable development triangle, even when you want to achieve sustainable consumption. Let me also tell you that some of the lessons I've learned on the production side, working with senior management of some very, very large multinationals, everything from supermarkets to energy, chemicals and mining. And basically what this tells you is the following, that if you look at the country-wise resource use per capita vertically and GDP per capita horizontally, you see that some countries are quite efficient. They have high GDP but low resource use. Now these countries have lower GDP but high resource use. So what we want is the countries here to grow along this path rather than that path. And that is what we are trying to do to influence consumers and producers. Let me skip this part and tell you about one last tool that we use. It's called value chain analysis. Okay? If you look at sustainable production, one of the things we want to do is be more resource efficient to find the hotspot. Now, if you look at the life cycle, everything from raw material production all the way through manufacturing and retail to consumer use and recycling, what we find is that for light bulbs and, let us say, greenhouse gas emissions, 95% happens in the consumer's home. So if you teach the consumer how to switch their lights on and off properly, you can reduce carbon emissions from light bulbs very substantially. If you look at orange juice, which is another retail product, the main emissions happen during transport, here in this case from Brazil to the UK. So if you focus on transport, the producers can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at milk production, 76% of the emissions happen in the farm, at the raw material production. So here, if you want to reduce carbon emissions, you have to focus on what is happening within the farm. So this is the way this kind of value chain analysis helps us. And the same thing can be done for water, for energy, for labor, for any other aspect that you want to think of. I'm going to skip through this and tell you that what we try to do here is to build a coalition of civil society and business, sustainable consumers and sustainable producers working together. Eventually, that kind of virtuous behavior will spread throughout society and we will have a sustainable society. And that is the vision of Sustainomics there. And of course, we need social capital and good governance. We need ethical media to disseminate the information so that the media have a very critical role to play. And I believe that Asia has a critical role to play in all of this because we have emerging economies. We are doing the right thing, or we know what to do in economic, social, and environmental terms. I think we can mobilize civil society and business to push governments to do the right thing. And we are the connector. We can connect south and south. We can connect south and north. So we've gone through the whole list of what, how, which, and how. Let me give you a mildly optimistic final message that although we face multiple problems, we should not despair. Okay? Remember, making development for more sustainable, we know what to do and we can start now to do it. We don't need to delay. We have to transform governance systems to deal with crises in an integrated way. We need to work with business and civil society, and I particularly believe that Asians can play a very key role in building this global eco-civilization. I give you an ancient blessing from Sri Lanka which says, may the rains come in time, it's environment. May the harvest be bountiful, which is economic. May the people be happy and contented. May the king be righteous, that is social. What I'm trying to tell you is that even in ancient times, they knew about the Sustainable Development Triangle. We're just simply rediscovering the wheel today and trying to hand it down to our children and grandchildren. So my institute works on sustainable development issues, and we are very glad to work with you. We also give awards, research fellowships and internships if you're interested. We do training and research. Here's a class of 300 people in China. These are civil servants in India. This is a group in Africa and so on. There are a number of books that are available, translated into Chinese and Portuguese. Thank you very much indeed. Over to you, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Professor Munasinghe. I really liked the slide with the old saying that you used to close down. That was a very thoughtful one. With that, I would like to open the floor to any questions that might have arisen from this webinar. And I would like to start with one of Daniela Carillon. And the question is, to what extent is green economy a viable proposal towards sustainable development?
Remember the figure that I showed. I think green economy is an important part of making development more sustainable, but we should be very careful that green economy should not exclude the social dimension. And that's why many people now talk about inclusive green economy, inclusive meaning including the poor. So when you talk about inclusive green economy, then you're back to the concept of sustainable development. The reason why people, I think, coined the word green economy is they felt that sustainable development has been tried for 20 years and people have got stuck with the wrong idea, and let's try a new idea. Yes, I think we should move forward, but and it is an important part of sustainable development, but if it excludes the poor, and I've been a poverty person for 40 years, if it excludes the poor, then I think we are missing something very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think you have a very good point there, and I hope that answer was clear to Daniela. A question that I'm having is with the recent events that we've seen, like Superstorm Sandy. It's amazing that there are still debates whether or not this can be categorized as climate change. But even if it is or if it's not, how would it fit in a sustainable development strategy?
Well, basically, I believe that we still have much scientific work to solve the problem of attribution. Okay, attribution is basically simply saying does A cause B. So before we say that Sandy was caused by climate change, we need to examine the evidence. I think there is growing evidence that storms and hurricanes have increased in frequency and in severity, both over the last 5 decades for sure, where records have been kept about the extent of the damage and so on and so forth. Now, that correlates very well with the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. But our models are not sufficiently detailed to say that a particular storm was caused by greenhouse gas emissions. I think what we can say is that the general trend is very unhealthy, that we will have more bigger and more frequent storms, and whether Sandy was caused specifically by climate change or not, we have what is called the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle says that if you have even a suspicion that something destructive is about to happen, then you should have some kind of insurance. This is like saying if your house is under risk to burn down, you buy a fire insurance policy. Now your house may actually never burn down, but at least by paying a small amount, you minimize the risk that if your house burns down, you at least have money to buy a replacement. So this is the whole idea, that we can't buy a new earth, but there are modest measures which we can take in terms of climate change mitigation and also climate change adaptation to reduce the risk from climate change impacts, including the impacts of hurricanes. And that can be done without interfering with our development strategy. And that is what I showed you, that we bend the curve of development so that we continue the fight against poverty and so on, but at the same time we climate-proof our planet. And meanwhile, we go on with the scientific work of attribution, of trying to prove that in fact Sandy or its successors are in fact caused by climate change. So we do everything at the same time in parallel, integrated, right?
Yeah, no, that's very clear. And a question that links to that a little bit about what can we do is from Katerina Vladimirova, and she asks, in which way can civil society groups and environmental NGOs influence the value shift towards more sustainable values? And how do you view the potential for civil society direct interaction with the public with respect to awareness raising and education in comparison to lobbying activities that are on a different level of governments and businesses?
Yeah, okay. Can people still see my screen or not?
Yes, we do.
Okay, let me just move back to something that I didn't really have time to look at, and that is this screen, this one, which talked about changing consumer behavior. I think, civil society are in fact the consumers. We are the people who have the power to do it. Now, unfortunately, as I said, we are being manipulated by advertising and even pricing and information to consume in an unsustainable way. I think if you look at the pattern of behavior, say a century ago, I think since there was less abundance and people had more respect for nature, that the people more frugal in their lifestyle. So the apparent overconsumption that is going on now is not something necessarily that we are programmed with for thousands of years. No, it's a relatively recent shift that we have more control over nature, we have more access to resources and so on. And it is of course driven by the social values of greed and selfishness and so on. Now, I told you a little bit about pricing. The conventional tools of information, pricing and so on can be used to make us consume more sustainably without penalizing the poor. And I went through that particular point. We have to also label information clearly so that when somebody buys a product in the supermarket, they know that this is either has a fair trade label, or there is a certain carbon footprint, or the energy consumption per unit is low. Now, this is tricky because consumers don't want to be confused. If they have 50 labels on a particular carton, they are going to get confused. So the labeling is a very tricky point. And finally, we have advertising. Every day we are being tweaked to buy more and to buy more expensive and more wasteful things. Now, if you ask producers, they will tell you they can use the same advertising tricks to tweak you the other way, to make you consume more sustainably. But they will not do that because most producers, many of them tell me, look, suppose I make sustainable products, maybe I'll go out of business. And meanwhile, sustainable consumers, like the lady who asked the question, are saying, I'm a sustainable consumer, but what can I do? Because all the advertising I see is for junk products, are very wasteful. Now, I'm saying those sustainable consumers should get together with the sustainable producers to build that chain so that they empower each other. And it's going to be a slow process. For example, it's a community process where you change values and socio-cultural patterns. The attitude to smoking took maybe 30 years to change. It was very macho, John Wayne did it and so on in the movies, but now people just run outside a building and smoke quickly in a corner and then rush back into the building. But it took many years. So we need producers also to work with this, and we need to think outside the box. I'll give you one other slide, okay, which is thinking outside the box, which is a new organization, okay, which I have launched with some colleagues at Rio Plus 20. How did it happen? Because the official discussions in Rio Centro by the governments were so boring and so disheartening that people had basically a people summit on the beach in Rio. And there were many more important discussions going on there in the People Summit, and among them was a whole musical program. People were playing music and so on. And we felt that the message of music and song can constitute a better way of appealing to the heart, because in this lecture I'm appealing to your mind. Sometimes you may not get the message, or only a very small proportion of the world's population, 0.001, are hearing that message. But everybody listens to music. So this is a new international group which we have formed, and you're very welcome to join, to use that medium. So there, again, I mean, there are many things we can do to make the world more sustainable and consumption and production more sustainable.
And would you say that music is then the easiest entry point to promote sustainable lifestyle? Or are there other entry points that might be easier, like, for example, subsidies or penalties or awareness creation?
All of the above. I mean, we have to, that's the whole message of integration. None of them are paramount. The reason why we thought of music is, of course, because people are music lovers, we were music lovers, but because the other methods are not working too well. We are trying pricing, and we are trying government regulations and this and that, and so on. So if we really want to get people to move, then we have to use a mass medium, maybe some of the social media. And let me tell you, in that vision that I presented earlier, I said that at the third level, in the 20 years in the future, our children and grandchildren can complete the process. We start the transition. But when I say complete the process, people in my generation don't even have any idea what the tools might be of communication 10, 20 years from now. It will be a new type of social medium. So what I'm basically trying is think outside the box. Use the traditional tools you mentioned, like pricing policy, like regulations, like advertising, but also think of the new ones that are going to emerge. And the new minds, the young people who will use those new tools, and how do we educate them? We have to give them the right values, then they will find the tools and the methods to get the job done, right?
And the idea of music and using music links to the question of Robin Beecroft, because music is linked to culture, but his question is a slight bit different, and he asks, are there any models for cultural effects that may embed changed behaviors from climate change? And those behaviors could be negative, such as alcohol or drug abuse from hopelessness, or those could be positive, such as openness to innovation and collective problem solving. Do you know about any models incorporating cultural effects?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there is a whole body of literature, particularly, let us say, linking the social and environmental systems, okay? I mean, to give you a very simple example, we don't have to invent new pathways. Let us look at the problem of deforestation. There are many small villages in traditional villages where community forestry has been practiced for hundreds of years, very successfully. And then you have modernization. Okay, a few people come from the city, they want to do something with the forest. They pay a lot of money to someone, few villagers buy up the forest, and they chop it down and use it for some other purpose. So basically what we are seeing is that very sustainable cultural patterns that have existed in the past have been destroyed or changed by modernization and what I call unethical and uncontrolled market forces coming in. So we have to be mindful of those, and these are also called environmental externalities, but there are many, many examples. And therefore, I think that socio-cultural dimension is very important. There are, as the questioner pointed out correctly, destructive drives, and there are also very positive ones. And I would say that globally we are at the edge of a cliff. I think we have 10 years to turn things around. The question is, do we turn things around before we fall off the cliff or afterwards? Afterwards means many millions of people will die. And so this socio-cultural transformation will have to happen very much faster than governments are planning for. And this is where all the sociologists and others have to help us. I mean, it's not just economic optimization. Let me just finish with this very quick point, that production and resource efficiency in production is a very important part of the solution, but it is not a sufficient condition. There was a very famous economist several hundred years ago called Jevons, who found the thing called Jevons paradox. He found that every time coal technology improved, the consumption of coal didn't go down, it went up. So this is what is happening. Every time we become more resource efficient, we think, okay, we'll now save our resources. No, consumption goes up very much faster, and so the overall resource depletion rises. So the production efficiency must be balanced by restraint on the consumption side. And that is where the socio-cultural matrix is very important, and the social capital is crucial.
Yep, that's a very good point. I have 3 more questions here, and I'll combine 2 of them, being one of Mohamed Tahir and one of Sisa Tumbu, of Numonka Lare. And the questions are, do you have got any success of mainstreaming Sustainomics strategy in the National Action Plan of Sri Lanka? And this person feels that governments in Asia are still not taking the issue very seriously. And linked to that, I want to take the other question, which is, do you think that all these measures are really feasible in countries with economies in transition that are highly dependent on strong economies and developing ones?
Okay, I followed the first part of the question, but the second part, the last part, I missed a little bit about the economies in transition.
Yeah, the question is, what was the success in Sri Lanka? Because
no, that part I got, but it's the second part.
The second part is, do you feel that all these measures that are developed are really feasible in countries with economies in transition?
Okay. Which are dependent on other countries. That was the point, right?
Yes,
the dependency was a key point. Yeah. Okay. I think this is, all the questions have been very much on the mark. Yes, in Sri Lanka, 25 years ago, I was a senior advisor to the president, and I basically helped to ran the energy sector and several other sectors. At that time, we had very good integrated models, and although sustainable development was not so developed in terms of models, we had models which integrated all these approaches into the economic planning of Sri Lanka. But these things change. As governments change, now some sectors of the Sri Lankan economy have mainstreamed some environmental and other issues. But it is not fully integrated into the national macroeconomic plan. If you read the strategy document for the country, it talks of sustainable development. In fact, at the 2002 Earth Summit in Johannesburg, I prepared the national document which talked exactly to the question, which says our national plan of Sri Lanka will be based on sustainable development. But I think we have fallen short in the implementation, as have most countries of the world. And I would say particularly in the Western countries where their thinking was mainly that sustainable development is something for the poor countries, not for the rich. What we are seeing here, what I've mentioned to you today, is that the rich countries also have to undergo a sustainability transformation. They have, in fact, a bigger problem of how to reduce their material consumption while maintaining their quality of life, right? So basically, my short answer to that question is in Sri Lanka, certain sectors, but not economy-wide, although we have the models. The best country that I can talk about is actually Bhutan, because they, from the king and the prime minister down, they are very keen on this concept of gross national happiness, and they are developing metrics of measuring happiness. So it goes beyond just integrating climate into their conventional economic plan. They are saying even the way we measure progress. It's not just GNP, we are even changing the way we measure progress. And I think that is more fundamental. As long as we measure progress only in terms of GNP and material production, then it is very difficult to convince decision makers to incorporate and do all the kinds of integration that I mentioned. And that brings me to the economies in transition. I would say they, as well as developing countries who are on the poor side. Remember, I showed you a graph with two arrows, a green arrow and a red arrow. I think there is a direction in which they can grow. First, at the very least, if these countries can adopt much more resource efficient production technologies, then they will be much more competitive in the global marketplace. And
is that also where the government has a role to motivate businesses to do so?
Yes, of course. That is exactly the point. The governments have a role. I don't say, that's why I always say business and civil society must push governments to do the right thing. Because what I'm saying is governments alone have not been very capable or effective. They must be pushed. But they are the only people who can really take action at the macro level. Yes.
I'm then going for the last question, and that's actually a question I got a number of times. I got it from Togo, from Mauritania, and from Tanzania. And the question is the following. We are planning to develop climate change strategies and an action plan. How can we use Sustainomics framework? Do you have a manual? How do we start developing such a strategy? And how do we get more resources, if any exist?
Okay, there I have a more positive story. I've worked with a number of countries where we have integrated climate strategy into the National Development Plan. In other words, that is a more narrow question where I can say there are a number of countries where we've done that, including in Sri Lanka, and particularly the adaptation and vulnerability reduction strategy, which would be very appropriate for Africa. There are tools. I mentioned the action impact matrix. We have those green national accounting and the macro modeling tools, but also we have very detailed tools of vulnerability assessment and adaptation methodologies which can be applied at the ground level. So, I mean, of course there are manuals, but these are not something that one can easily learn by themselves. What we normally do is, I mean, just very briefly, since the question was asked, MIND has a team of people who would go, we do capacity building. Okay, so we tell people in those developing countries how to do it, and we leave them with knowledge and the tools and the manuals so that they can continue to do it themselves. There are a number of country case studies that I can provide.
I think that answers the question, and I also would like to say that any resources that will be made available will be posted on SeaChange together with a recording of this webinar, and I will do so in the coming days, and at that point an email will go out to all of you who have been attending here and also to those who didn't make it today. And with that said, I would like to give a warm thanks to Professor Munasinghe for his time. It was an enlightening presentation on Sustainomics, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure that the attendees looking at the numbers that came today also enjoyed it. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much indeed. I enjoyed it also, and I hope to keep in touch with the attendees. Please, I hope you can make my email available, and you can contact me or members of my staff at MIND, and we'll try to be as helpful as possible. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And I also got that question. Can we get the email? Yes, the information will be made available offline, including this presentation, and in it, and also in my introduction, will be the email that you can use to contact Professor Munasinghe. And a point that I get here is as well, it was a very good presentation, and people really enjoyed it. I get a few messages from participants, and as such I want to close this webinar, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dennis. It's been a pleasure.